Let's talk about Israel and Palestine. The bombs and the rockets have stopped falling, but the problems that led to the recent violence haven't gone away. There have been announcements about reconstruction and vague commitments about improving lives.
Leaders on both sides will need to chart a better course, starting by making real improvements in the lives of people in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank.
But there's not even a hint of a long-term solution, and the political backdrop doesn't look good for finding one.
You have a political crisis in Gaza, you have a political crisis in the Palestinian Authority, you have a political crisis in Israel.
Then there's the Americans and their relationship with Israel.
It's not one of the U.S. having leverage over Israel. It's simply one of the United States being Israel's cheerleader.
So when it comes to Israel, Palestine, and the politics at play, here are 3 things you need to know. The first thing you need to know is that Palestinian leadership is divided. On one side, there's Hamas. They control the Gaza Strip. It's their military wing that was firing some of the rockets at Israel. The US and Israel consider Hamas terrorists. In Gaza, Hamas is led by Yahya Sinwar. Then there's the Palestinian Authority. The PA was set up in 1994, and it's effectively like the Palestinian government. But today, with Hamas in control of Gaza, the PA's control is very limited, except for parts of the West Bank. And even there, it's Israel as the occupying power that has control over most things. Since 2005, the PA has been controlled by Fatah, a political party led by Mahmoud Abbas. He's the Palestinian president and represents Palestine on the international stage. This split between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority creates all sorts of problems and raises the question of who actually represents the Palestinians.
This is a really difficult question to answer. And the reason it's difficult to answer is because we have not had elections in more than 15 years.
The PA was going to hold elections in May, but Mahmoud Abbas canceled them at the last minute. He said it was because of Israeli restrictions on campaigning and voting in occupied East Jerusalem. But some Palestinians question if that's the whole story.
I don't think that we should minimize what it means to have elections in Jerusalem. That being said, I think that the elections were canceled because Mahmoud Abbas wasn't confident with the outcome.
As long as the Palestinians are politically divided between Hamas and Fatah and geographically divided between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, there's really no hope for any serious negotiations to be successful. It's also been Israeli and American policy to perpetuate this division.
Now, this political division has existed for a long time, but it now seems there's another center of political power that's getting stronger. And that's the power of the Palestinian people themselves, on the streets and across social media.
This is humanitarian, and this is about standing up for the oppressed.
This march is going to be very, very important.
The last few weeks, we have seen Palestinians organize and coordinate resistance all over the world, not just inside Palestine. We were all connected to each other.
People are opening their eyes, and they're really saying that enough is enough. We as a people are united behind one idea, and that one idea is that we want to be free.
So that's an overview of the situation on the Palestinian side. The second thing you need to know is that on the Israeli side, politics are also in a mess. In March, Israel held its 4th election in 2 years without a clear result. There were weeks of deal-making, and now Benjamin Netanyahu is being pushed out after 12 years in power. His opponents formed a coalition with Naftali Bennett, a far-right politician, set to be the new prime minister. He's supported by Yair Lapid, a centrist who's expected to take over as prime minister in 2 years.
This is essentially an 8-party coalition, and the only thing the 8 parties were able to agree upon is the removal of Benjamin Netanyahu from office.
So how does all this play into the Israeli-Palestinian issue? Well, of course, it's hard to say definitively. The issue hasn't come up much in any of the recent election campaigns, and most Israelis support keeping things with the Palestinians pretty much as they are. But here's what we know about the new leaders.
Naftali Bennett is in many ways more hardline, more ideological than Netanyahu. He is somebody who has explicitly called for the formal annexation of much of the West Bank. But Yair Lapid is hardly a dove. He hasn't really pushed for a change in Israel's policies toward the occupation.
If you want to look at the half full glass, it is promising that things are not going to deteriorate between Israel and the Palestinian. If you want to look at the half empty glass, it's a prescription for perpetrating the status quo.
Okay, so on the Palestinian side, we've got a major political split, and on the Israeli side, we've got chronic political uncertainty, even with the new coalition. It doesn't exactly look great when it comes to finding the kind of committed, maybe even visionary political action needed to bring lasting peace.
And it's in that context that this war broke out. You can get a truce, you can stop the fighting. I don't think you can resolve the underlying issues, but you should, in the peacemaking efforts that follow, try to plant the seeds that will get you to a better place.
Now, the other big factor in all this is the U.S.'s relationship with Israel. Because the third thing you need to know is that the U.S. has always been Israel's biggest supporter.
This is a good day for affirming the eternal friendship between Israel and the United States.
America is Israel's oldest and best friend in the world.
The United States is proud to stand with you as your strongest ally and your greatest friend.
I will always stand with our great friend and partner, the State of Israel.
For Palestinians, it often feels like this friendship comes at their expense. And under President Trump, it reached a whole new level. He recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moved the U.S. Embassy there from Tel Aviv. This ignored Palestinian claims to East Jerusalem as their capital. He pulled more than $200 million in aid to the Palestinian Authority, and the U.S. had opposed Israeli settlements, but Trump reversed that policy. So going forward, the question is how the Biden administration might do things differently. And so far, there has been a change of tone compared to the Trump years.
I'm here to underscore the commitment of the United States to rebuilding a relationship with the Palestinian Authority and with the Palestinian people.
But when Israel started bombing Gaza in May, it took 8 days for Biden to express support for a ceasefire. The U.S. also blocked 3 attempts by the UN Security Council to condemn the violence. And around the same time, news broke about a U.S. weapons sale to Israel worth $735 million.
The fact of the matter is we are still sending $3.8 billion to the Israeli government in military funding every single year. And the overwhelming majority of Congress is unwilling to put even the most basic conditions on that aid.
But when it comes to U.S. support for Israel, we've recently seen a lot more open criticism.
We must condition aid to Israel on compliance with international human rights and end the apartheid.
Many members of Congress have instead fallen back on a blanketed statement defending Israel's airstrikes against civilians under the guise of self-defense.
The idea that it's even remotely controversial to call what Israel has imposed on Palestinians a form of apartheid is laughable.
But does the U.S. leadership have any appetite to really deal with the underlying issues?
It seems the Biden strategy, the Biden policy, is to put a lid on this conflict and not even try to make the effort to try and solve it. That, I think, is because they believe right now the time is not right for peace.
The thing is, it seems that it's never been the right time for peace. But from Palestine to the U.S. to cities around the world, the voices calling for some kind of change are getting louder. For politicians, the pressure is on.
It's going to be us who are going to change the system, not the leaders who are going to change the system. I think the people are leading and the leaders are going to follow.
If you want to know more about some of the issues that caused the violence we saw in May, check out our episode on how the fighting between Israelis and Palestinians got so bad. You can find that and other Start Here content on YouTube and our social media pages. See you next week.